I'm not going to talk about what has happened in the past. We are tired of hearing about mistakes done by various people. We need to move beyond that. So I'm going to take maybe 10 minutes, 12 minutes and try to articulate what I think we need to do. And I'm going to do it with an example. In Sri Lanka, in the 1960s, that decade, soon after independence and all that, Sri Lanka's manufacturing growth was very high. We had 8.3% in the value added in manufacturing. But soon thereafter, those numbers fell. We had about 10% in manufacturing in the early 60s. I'm talking about the 50s, before we got into the ideological change. And then in the decade of 70s and the 80s, we had manufacturing growth of about 5.5%. The highest manufacturing growth we've seen in this country was between 90 and 94. That was around 9%. Then it fell to about 7% in the next administration, and it fell thereafter. And now it's obviously negative, but it's very low. The point I'm trying to make is our future has to be through jobs created in manufacturing. And if people think that we are not able to participate in global manufacturing, I'm going to tell you that it is wrong. Right? It is true that we are a service country. It is true that we need tourism. We need all the other things. Software exports obviously is going to be major. But if you think about this country where it is now, and we need to bring our people back on track and create jobs, where are those jobs going to come from? Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about the past, but it is necessary to know that it is the liberalization, right, that created inputs that were imported, increased FDIs, and access to low labor, even though at a lower cost at that time, that created what we call growing total factor productivity. And I want us to understand this. We can talk about many things, but unless we become a productive nation, we are not going to go anywhere. Please note, this world is in stagnation. Whether it is Japan or whether it is India, whether it is in China, whether it is in the European Union or the US, people are losing jobs, inflation is rising, countries are going into recession. So globally, there is what we call stagflation, which is the most difficult question for any economist to resuscitate a country out of. So in a situation like that, how do we grow? How do we grow? We all know the economics. If you reduce unemployment, inflation goes up. If you reduce inflation, unemployment goes up. There is some balance there. Now, in this situation where inflation is high and unemployment is also high, what do we do? So people say, hello, how can we grow? Interest rates are 36%. Then they say, well, if we don't increase interest rates to 36%, 40%, inflation is going to run out of control. Right? So we are in a dilemma. So if you really think about the theory behind it, forget about the politics, what we need to do is to create efficient enterprises in this country. We need to create highly productive enterprises in this country. Right? And jobs must be created where we can grow without the associated inflation with growth. By 93 in this country, between 81 and 93, 25% of total output came from what is called total factor productivity. What is total factor productivity? Total factor productivity is the increase in output above and beyond the use of inputs. So that is technology. That is management know-how. That is how you sort of organize, coordinate an enterprise. But what we saw in this country is total factor productivity continued to fall to something like 0.5% annual average growth in the last few years, as opposed to in the 90s around 4% on an annual average growth rate. So what we have seen in the first set of reforms in the 78, post 78 to around 2000, we saw manufacturing exports grow at a US dollar average of about 30%, right? In US dollar terms, right? It went from almost nothing when we started to about 70% of exports by the early 2000s. That is because mainly our foreign investment in domestic enterprises or new enterprises that were started either within the zones or outside of the zones. By mid-90s, 80% of all manufacturing exports came from either foreign-owned industrial enterprises or joint ventures. Now, what has happened in the world? In the 60s, countries manufactured things in their own countries. But there was a dramatic shift between the 60s, subsequent 80s, 90s, and more recently in a much more massive scale from mature developing industrial countries to developing countries. In the 70s, only 10% of manufactured exports came from developing countries. Now, close to 60% of manufacturing exports come from developing countries, right? But the question is, why have we not been able to capture a significant component of manufacturing exports in the world? Now, I give you some numbers for you to think about, ladies and gentlemen, because we are all young professionals, right? We think about these things, we appreciate data. We are not here just to talk nonsense, but to understand, right? Our share of manufacturing exports in 1976 was 0.02%, right? Manufacturing export share of Sri Lanka among developing country exports was 0.02%. By early 2000s, it went up to 0.3%, okay? But by 2015, it has fallen to 0.15%. So we are falling. We are falling. And compare that with sort of where this is coming from, right? It's mainly coming from apparels. It's mainly coming from apparels. And beyond apparel, some sort of diversification has happened. Rubber products, leather goods, footwear, right? You have big companies like Camso and Trelleborg, which I think are bought over by, I think, Michelin. Except for those, we haven't really seen, since the advent of the apparel sector, during Mr. Premadasa's time, any new real enterprise growth. No job creation in manufacturing, right? But if you look at apparels, what you see is no longer just the traditional apparels. We see modern industry, right? In the 90s, mid-90s, it was just tailor shops. Domestic value added was about 20%. But thanks to companies like MAS, Brandix, and Hydramani in particular, these have gone from just glorified tailor shops to real modern sort of basic fashion, right? Moved up. And you know that they produce in this country now almost 80% in knitted fabric and about 20% of woven fabric. So if you really look at the backward linkages in this industry, we see about 60% of what is necessary, either in textiles or in accessories, in hangers and various other things, buttons and all that, zips, not zips, buttons and all that, coming from locally produced industry. So the point I'm trying to make is that, okay, we have some industry that is growing, and it is going to link backwards and forwards, and sideways, both ways. So it is possible, right? This is a great example that I'm talking about. But we missed out a lot, because our industrial journey has been very lopsided. That is because we didn't participate in what we call production sharing networks. Now think about what we said, right? In the 60s, what was built in one country, now it is built in multiple countries, right? So that is the production sharing, what we call within vertically integrated globalized industries. And particularly these things happen not in apparels, but in telco equipment, in computers, in electrical and electronic apparatus, scientific equipment, what we broadly call electrical and electronics, right? So the prime mover in the global shift of production to developing countries has been the concept of sharing production. And we missed out on that entire journey, right? So it's cross-border dispersion of processes that opens opportunities for countries to participate in different stages, right, of the production processes of a given product, depending on your cost advantage, right? So the point I'm trying to get to is, if you look at these countries that are growing rapidly, they are very much a part of these production networks. And also recall, these are two types of production networks. One is producer-driven networks, where you have patents and technology, as opposed to buyer-driven networks, where somebody says, here's the cloth, here is the zip, here is the thing, you create a piece of garment for me. Not that. Where there is copyright, where there is what you call proprietary knowledge, right? And that is what brings value to exports or manufactured industries. I'm not going to talk too much, and I'm going to soon stop, Harshana, if you allow me. I'm going to give you two examples where we missed out. In Motorola in 1980, we started a company with 2,600 people, and Harris Corporation, which was a large tech company in the US, Texas, I think, with 1,850 people in 1983. Both these companies came here, signed agreements, and started setting up shop. But after 1983, due to all what happened in 84, they left. They went to Penang, and they have created a huge ecosystem on electronics in these areas. Now, just to give one example of a country that we must try to emulate and try to overtake is Vietnam, which is growing in leaps and bounds, right? I'm not going to give you the statistics, but just to tell you that they have really understood the concept of production sharing and created large numbers of jobs in Vietnam. Not just in apparels, also in apparels, but in machines, parts, components, telco equipment, apparels, footwear. Just to give you an idea, there are 200 Nike factories in Vietnam. There are 76 Adidas factories in Vietnam. Foxconn, in the last 9 months, invested $2.1 billion in Vietnam. It created 10,000 jobs in that country. In the last few months, 33 projects, new foreign direct investments came for $1.7 billion. Now, has Sri Lanka really fallen behind? I'm glad that Mr. Pallevatta is here. I mean, guys like Rohan and others have really participated in this process, even though not talked about much. What we call micro MNCs, or multinational corporations that are small, have only operations in a few countries. These are mid-sized companies in electronics and electricals. According to data that has been disaggregated, people believe that industry, about 20-30 companies, probably export about $1 billion a year, which is not a small number when you compare the just a few entities that have gone into that space, right? And if you ask them, you will see, and data shows that we have the right kind of labor. We can train the management know-how is there, supervisory capacity is there. So what I'm trying to argue, and I will stop now, is that the light at the end of the tunnel that the honorable leader talked about, has to have some, it just won't appear, right? Even if it appears, we have to go towards it, right? And to go towards that light, we have to somehow create the opportunities, incentives, the platforms for people to come in and participate in these global production networks and start creating jobs. And we cannot continue to sort of depend on low skill, low tech, low productivity, low efficient enterprise. That just will not help us get to the point where we want to, because we are a bankrupt nation. This is the best time, if there was any time at all in our past, to make these changes. So what the SJB is talking about is such change, dramatic change, right? We believe that jobs have to be created. And what kind of jobs? If you look at how countries came out of poverty, countries like China, 800 million people out of poverty. Where did those jobs come from? Right? Those jobs came from manufacturing. Right? Yes, services are important, but the idea that we are pushing is that we have to liberalize, we have to open our borders, we have to break down the walls around this country, we have to build bridges, we have to reform trade and investment policy, and we must get into regional trade agreements. We must fear not. We have to be brave, because there's no other way, right? So that's the point I wanted to make, that we have a clear plan, and that under the leadership of Mr. Premadasa, we have a good team, and we have an idea as to how to take this country forward. So those were the remarks I wanted to make.
රිපෝට වාරණයෙන් තොර අපක්ෂපාතී වාර්තාකරණය